Good morning. Welcome to this broadcast of the Go-create grant application webinar on 6th of May for anyone who's watching the recording on YouTube. My name is James Rule. I'm OxLEP's compliance consultant, so I advise the Growth Hub teams on running grant programs and keeping to all the rules and regulations that we have to follow. Next slide, please. We have a fairly straightforward agenda today, since we're just covering the Innovation Support for Business Go-create grants. The first part of the presentation, I will run through the Go-create grants scheme and the process. So that's eligibility, what's available, how you apply, the rules and key dates. I'm then going to run through a few slides on why applications are unsuccessful, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. We've got 45 minutes available for questions, but we will carry on and stop sooner if there aren't that many questions. But if you have questions that you suddenly think of at midday, just after we've finished, please send all questions to the business@oxfordshirelep.com email address so that we can answer them. Questions that you ask will be translated into our frequently asked questions, our Q&A relating to the Go-create grants, which are available on the website. So where possible, please can you keep questions fairly generic and certainly don't provide any commercially confidential information. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, but please type them into the chat bar for the webinar. And there's a couple of members of the team on hand who'll be able to pick those up, and if they can be answered as we go along, we'll answer them then. Otherwise, we'll pick them up in the Q&A session, where I'll be joined by Sophie Lee, the Programme Exec for the ISfB project, and Peter Russell, Business Advisor for the project. So on to the next slide. A little bit of background. Who are OxLEP? We are the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. We are one of a network of, I think it's 29 local enterprise partnerships across England, and we're responsible for supporting and promoting economic growth, development, skills within Oxfordshire. The Innovation Support for Business project falls under the OxLEP Business part of the organisation and within the aegis of the Growth Hub. Growth Hubs are common to all local enterprise partnerships. Everyone operates a Growth Hub, and they are a key point of business support for local businesses. But there's a variety of different models. Some Growth Hubs are as simple as a website with advice and downloadable resources. Others just have a phone line. We operate what I think I can describe as a full service Growth Hub, providing specific business support, of which the ISfB programme is part. Next slide. So the first question that I'm going to address, bearing in mind that the Go-create grants for ISfB are funded by the European Regional Development Fund, is whether there are any changes that result from the UK's departure from the European Union. The short answer is none. Nothing changes. Despite the UK's departure, the programmes still remain part of the European Structural Investment Fund programme until they close in a couple of years' time. They are therefore still governed by the EU regulations and the UK managing authorities' guidance that they produced based on those regulations. So the flexibilities that are coming in for UK funding, things like the UK subsidy scheme that replaces the EU state aid scheme, does not apply to this programme because it's still governed by the European rules. Next slide. So who is eligible to receive the grants? These grants are aimed at SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. So that is a business with less than 250 employees that is not more than 25% owned by a business that is not itself an SME. So what that means is that if you are 50% owned by Microsoft, for example, you will not count as an SME. If you are 50% owned by another SME, then you should still count as an SME, but we'd have to look at the group structure, so both businesses together, to ensure that you had less than 250 employees, and then the turnover and balance sheet that I'll come on to. There's a couple of ownership elements that don't count. So venture capital firms do not count towards the SME eligibility status. Similarly, universities don't count. Effectively, the regulations are looking at who has a controlling interest, who can control the business in a way that goes above and beyond standard board membership. The other two elements that we need to look at for the definition are the turnover and or the balance sheet. So the turnover can be less than 50 million euros, or the balance sheet can be less than 43 million euros, or they can both be less than those thresholds. And we're looking at the figures from your last published set of accounts. That's the last set of accounts registered with Companies House. Next slide. Hopefully the text on here is a little larger for you than it is for me. I think you can see the full screen. One thing that we cannot support are undertakings in difficulty. These are fairly clearly defined in the regulations. It's a a black and white line in the sand, really. It does not include SMEs less than 3 years old. So if you're less than 3 years old, this test will not apply to you. But an undertaking in difficulty is an undertaking, so an SME, that effectively has lost more than half of its share capital as a result of accumulated losses. Okay. There's a couple of other elements that fall into that. You can be subject to insolvency proceedings. That's fairly obviously an undertaking in difficulty. Or you can be in receipt of rescue or restructuring aid. Again, it's fairly obvious that you'll be an undertaking in difficulty then. And for those two options, the insolvency proceedings and the rescue or restructuring aid, you will certainly know if you're in that position. We're looking at the age and financial position of the business as at the 31st of December 2019. So this was a flexibility introduced to address the impact of COVID-19 on businesses. It became fairly clear quite quickly that a significant proportion of businesses would fail the share capital and accumulated losses test as a result of COVID. So they said that in order to negate the impact of COVID, we could perform the test looking at the position of the business at the end of December 2019, so before COVID had any impact. And at the moment, we're still allowed to look at December 19 until the end of June 2021. And I have a suspicion that that flexibility will be extended again. But I'll cover that in future grant webinars if it is. It's a simple calculation based on your last full year set of accounts, the balance sheet that you've submitted to Companies House, or your position at 31st December 2019 if that is materially different from your accounts of, say, March 2019. You will already have completed a self-declaration when you signed up to the Go-create program that says that you're not an undertaking difficulty. It's worth noting that we're obliged to carry out formal checks if you're applying for more than £50,000 of support from the program. So if you were applying for a grant of, I don't know, £49,000, say, but also intended to attend a series of workshops that would push you over the £50,000 threshold for the program, we would have to formally check and keep a record that we've checked the undertaking difficulty test. Otherwise, we just have to do random spot checks, which is why we cover it off in the applications. So the next slide has a couple of scenarios set out on it. Thank you. Just to show how this works in practice. So, company with a share capital of £10,000, no accumulated losses, clearly that passes the undertaking difficulty test. £10,000 of capital, cumulative losses 4,999, again passes the test. That's 49.99% of share capital lost. No problem, not an undertaking difficulty. The next line down is a fail. Share capital of 10,000, accumulated losses of £5,001, so more than 50% of that capital. It fails the undertaking difficulty test. As I said, it's a clear line in the sand. This test, you're either pass or fail. And then share capital of 10,000, accumulated losses 15, clearly failed. They've lost 150% of share capital. There are some businesses that are set up without any share capital. In those cases, effectively, you cannot have a loss on the books. If you have a loss, you will immediately fail the test because you've lost more than 50% of nothing. In all of these cases, we recommend you speak to your accountant if you're unsure. And I've written the little capital plus profit and loss account needs to be greater than capital divided by 2 formula to do it as a shorthand. This can be quite a complicated area. We're happy to take questions on it. It's always easier to write them down because these are invariably company-specific questions. If in doubt, ask your accountant or ask us. Next slide. Thank you. So the key eligibility issues with Go-create grants, things that we cannot include. These are the things that keep popping up in grant applications that we see. We cannot cover staff costs. So anything that is salaried, anything that goes out through PAYE, anybody where you have an employment contract is not an eligible cost for an ISfB Go-create grant. VAT can only be included if it is irrecoverable. So if you cannot recover that VAT from HMRC, either because you're not registered for VAT or because your specific VAT position means that for this project you cannot recover VAT, then it is an eligible project cost. Please seek advice on your VAT position. OxLEP cannot give VAT advice to businesses. So you should please speak to your accountant or whoever advises you on VAT issues. It is a complicated area. We do require copies of your procurement audit trail and evidence of the 3 quotes that you will have sought. So for anything less than £25,000, we're expecting to see copies of 3 written quotes. I do come back to this in later slides. There will clearly be instances where a single tender is appropriate, so a single quote is appropriate because there are no other suppliers. So for example, I'm looking to do Facebook advertising. The only person who can provide a quote, or the only organization who can provide a quote for Facebook advertising is Facebook. Therefore, there is only one place to seek a quote. If, however, you were looking for marketing support and you're going to use a consultancy to do that Facebook advertising, we would expect 3 written quotes from 3 different marketing companies, even though the expectation is that within those quotes, part of them would be 3 identical Facebook costs. For anything that costs £24,999 or more, so over 25,000, this has to be secured through an open procurement process. The RDF money is public funding and it does come with some public procurement requirements, even though private businesses, SMEs, are not usually bound by public procurement requirements. For anything that costs more than £25,000, 25,000 or more, I should say, There is a requirement that it be openly advertised, so on your own website and on the Contracts Finder portal, which is the government portal advertising all opportunities over £25,000. We can help with that. We can put opportunities onto Contracts Finder for you. You then require a formal specification that sets out the total value, what you're looking to buy, and how you propose to make the selection decision. We'll also require you to carry out scoring of responses exactly the same way as you said you would, demonstrate that the applications were received or the tenders were received before the deadline, demonstrate that you notified everyone. We have a checklist to run through for both the three written quotes and the Contracts Finder element of the program. Sorry about that. I just got a message threatening me with a laptop restart. I'm hoping that will not happen during this webinar. It didn't give a time. So there's the open procurements. It's worth saying that anything that falls above the OJU threshold, so 183, I think, or £84,000 for services, will need to be advertised on the UK's Find a Tender website. It may also need to go onto the OJU website. I need to clarify that. I think it's very unlikely that anyone will be procuring anything of that value. So what I would expect most people to have to do is worry about a Contracts Finder process. If you think you're going to run an open procurement, we do not expect you to do it in advance of the grant being approved and awarded, because it's time consuming, it's difficult, so it's possible that something will go wrong and we'd hate for you to have to restart it. And one of the things that we will do if the grant is awarded is sit down with you and make sure that you're comfortable with the process that you need to go through. Another eligibility issue that frequently comes up is that your selected supplier, your preferred supplier, is one that's already been involved in your business. Now, it is acceptable to use a supplier that you've used in the past, but what you must be able to do is to demonstrate that you have sought alternative quotes, and you must have a rationale for selecting the supplier that you've chosen. A rationale that says we've chosen this supplier because we always use them is not an acceptable rationale. A rationale that says we've chosen this supplier because they are the least expensive, which is probably due to their familiarity with the business, and they also provide the most comprehensive service, is acceptable. We're not going to query that. Another area where we frequently find grant recipients have problems is in terms of defrayal, particularly where you use credit cards or overseas bank accounts to pay for things. It's perfectly acceptable to pay for something using a business credit card, not a problem at all. The audit trail for us will be the same as defrayal from a bank account. We'll expect the invoice, we'll expect a copy of the credit card bill. What we will also then require is evidence that you've paid that credit card bill and that the amount paid is at least the same as the amount you've put on the credit card. So if you spend £1,000 on something on a credit card, we need to be able to show that you have repaid that £1,000 onto the credit card, because the grant is based on defrayed expenditure, so money that you as a business have paid out. If it's on a credit card, then the credit card has paid the money out. You as a business have not, until the point at which you reimburse the card. The other area that can cause confusion is using overseas bank accounts. This can be easier. It can avoid transaction fees, converting sterling to euros or dollars or whatever it may be. This is acceptable, but please let us know if that's what you plan to do, because it can be a little bit more complicated to evidence. When an auditor walks through the audit trail for these payments, they'll look at the value on the invoice, and they'll expect to see a corresponding value on a defrayal evidence, so a bank account evidence, and they'll then expect to see a corresponding value in a claim form. The problem that you have with an overseas bank account is that although your US dollar value will match, there's nothing that tells an auditor how the sterling figure that you're claiming from us relates to that overseas bank account figure. So what you need to do is to make sure that the exchange rate that you're using is one that an auditor can check back to. Effectively, for sterling to euros, it's the ECB, European Central Bank exchange rate, in force at the date of the transaction. Please talk to it. It's a lot easier if you discuss that with us before you make your claims, rather than us having to send a variety of queries back to reverse engineer the calculation. Next slide. So there is a difference in ERDF terms between revenue and capital costs. Any item, so anything that costs less than £4,999, excluding VAT, is classed as revenue. So that's perfectly acceptable. This doesn't include consultants, doesn't include services. We're looking at specific items, specific things. If it costs over £1,000 but below the £4,999, it's classed as a mobile asset. It's still a revenue cost, so it is still an eligible cost for the programme. But for those mobile asset items, we have to log them in the ISfB asset register. That means we're going to need various bits of information, such as the serial number, where it's stored, how you'll depreciate it, and some photos of the asset in place to reassure the auditor that it actually does exist, that the serial number we're quoting is the serial number stuck on the back of the asset. And when we say photos, please provide us with photos of the asset in situ. We do quite frequently receive lovely close-up photos of, I don't know, a 3D printer, for example, which are so close up that the 3D printer could be sitting in somebody's garage rather than in the building where it's supposed to be sitting. So please make sure there's enough context to show an auditor that it is where we say it is. Any item that costs over £5,000, excluding VAT, is a capital item and it's not eligible. We have withdrawn the capital element of the Go-create grants due to lack of take-up. We did have interest from people requesting capital expenditure. We introduced it and have had absolutely no interest, no take-up, no applications requesting any capital spend at all into the programme. So we've withdrawn that element. ISfB Go-create grants are now fully revenue-based grants again, and the capital funding will be redeployed within the programme. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what can't, oh no, back. Thank you. So what can't we fund? I've said salary costs. We cannot fund any salary costs. Consultants paid by invoices on an hourly or daily rate or a fixed fee, perfectly acceptable. They're not salaried staff. Please ensure that you are compliant with the revised IR35 regulations when you're using consultants. Travel and expenses costs we can't cover. VAT payments that you can recover from HMRC we cannot reimburse. We can't cover debt or interest related costs. So no debt, no refinancing, and nor can we cover statutory or legislative requirements. So if there's anything that you have to do by law, it's not something that we can cover. So for example, if in order to sell your innovative product, that product by law has to be certified to a certain standard, we cannot cover the fees relating to achieving that standard. If, however, there's a standard that you are not required to have. It's not a legal requirement, but would make your innovative product more attractive to the market. That is something that we can include in eligible costs because it's not a requirement. We can't include training costs. Now, that does not include leadership and management development, so things like mentoring are acceptable, but we cannot fund the cost of sending staff on a course, for example, certainly not where there would be a qualification at the end of it. The reason for that is that skills training qualifications relate to the European Social Fund. It's a different stream of European funding. We cannot cover vehicle purchases, nor can we cover any hire purchase arrangements because they include an interest element. Next slide. We definitely can't cover vehicle purchases or hire purchase. This is deliberately on there twice. The reason for that is that when auditors come to Oxfordshire projects, vehicle purchases is something that they do check for. There was a historic Oxfordshire project that came to the end, or came close to the end of its project, realised it had an underspend in its budget, and went out and bought a car, because that was quite an effective way of getting a large amount of money out the door in one go, and was reasonably useful. The auditors, as you can probably imagine, had a fit when they saw this, and the cost had to be recovered from the grant recipient. So it is something that is on auditors' radar when they come to Oxfordshire. We can't cover the like-for-like or routine replacement of something. So if you have a machine that manufactures a certain number of widgets in a certain time and it needs replacing, it's breaking, if you just do a standard routine replacement because it's worn out, or a like-for-like replacement, I'm buying the same machine again, it's not something we can fund. There is no added value of a simple like-for-like or routine replacement. Nor can we cover what they call preventative or remedial maintenance. So our machine is about to break down. In order to make sure that it can continue to do exactly the same as it did beforehand, we need to have it serviced, we need to replace one or two parts. That's not eligible for the same reason. There is no added value from the public investment. You are still able to do exactly what you could do when you started. If, however, your machine is wearing out and you're going to buy a much cleverer machine, a much more whizzy machine, you can make twice as many widgets of several different types that you couldn't do before, that is an eligible cost because it's not a like-for-like replacement. We can't support the building or refurbishment of retail facilities. And because the grants are offered under the de minimis state aid exemption, there are some specific sectors that we can't support. We can't support the primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture. So no farms, no fish farms. There can be a bit of confusion about what counts as primary production. We do now have a link to, I think it's the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU, that is now the place that defines primary production. So if in doubt, please ask, we can advise. We can't support the road freight sector, nor can we support services of general economic interest. When I used to deliver this in a room, in a face-to-face environment, I used to look around and ask who knew that, and other than the few people who'd had the discussion with me, I usually used to get a fairly blank response. Services of general economic interest are the sort of activities that OxLEP undertakes. There are also things like schools, the National Health Service, the police, that sort of thing. We can't fund export-related activities. So what that doesn't mean is that you are not allowed to export your products that you develop as a result of the Go-create grant. What it means is that we cannot help you to fund the setup of your export infrastructure. So there is a difference between those two approaches. nor can we support rather activities which favour domestic over imported goods. So if you say to us that we're looking for a grant and one part of our grant appeal is we're only willing to use Oxfordshire-based suppliers, we're not willing to look any further, that would be something that we couldn't support because you are favouring domestic over imported goods. So it has to be openly competitive. Next slide. So there are, as you can imagine, a series of deliverables that we report against. Some of these are fairly straightforward. We report the amount of grant that we've paid to you. We know that because we paid it to you. It's not a problem. We report the amount of match that you've provided against that grant. Again, we know how much this is because it's been part of your grant claim. We report on employment increase. So this is new jobs created as a result of the grant project. We report new products that you've introduced either to your business and or to the market. So because this is all about developing innovative new products, you might find that you've developed a prototype of your product that will count as a new product into the firm. If you take that prototype further and you're at the point of sale or about to be at the point of selling it, so there's some slight flexibility there, that's something that would count as a new to the market product. For both employment increase and new products, there are some evidence requirements. They are both self-declaration, so we have an impacts form where you say, well, I used to have this many employees, and as a result of the grant, I now have this many employees, which is an increase of whatever the difference is. And then you need to list the jobs created, not the individuals filling it, the job titles, the approximate salaries, and some equalities data on the staff in post. In terms of new products, again, it's a self-declaration. You need to tell us what those products are. And then there is supporting evidence that goes with it. Now that supporting evidence will be whatever it is you have produced that supports the product. So what I mean by that is that where you have a new product, excuse me, that you've launched into the market, you will have some marketing materials. At the very least, I would hope you'll have a page on your website that says this new product is launched on whatever the day is. Here's the anticipated cost, here's how you find out more details and place an order. So there's some evidence that supports that that product is new, that it's out there on the market. We also report new businesses that we've supported. There's nothing that you as an applicant need to do here. You are either less than 12 months old or you're more than 12 months old. If you're less than 12 months old, from our point of view, we count you as a new business that we're able to support. For all of these, as I say, evidence is needed, and there's a form. I've mentioned the impacts form. We do have plenty of forms, I'm afraid, to make sure that we have a clear audit trail so that when the auditor comes to visit, they stop at OxLEP. The design for the process is that an auditor should never need to come and ask you as a grant recipient for additional information. Next slide. So the Innovation Support for Business programme has three elements to it: grants, which are the subject of the workshop, facilities, and business support, the innovation support products. The grants we're talking about, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about these. The innovation facilities were the Eco Business Centre up at Bicester, the Agile and Prototyping, one day I will correct that slide, laboratories up at Begbrook. And we had hoped to develop a co-working space in the centre of Oxford, but unfortunately we haven't been able to achieve that. We also deliver what we call some innovation support products, which are a series of workshops and one-to-one support with ISfB business advisors. And then there's the grants. The programme itself is a partnership. OxLEP is the lead delivery partner, and until the end of last year, the programme was delivered alongside the University of Oxford, the City Council, Chilwell District Council, and Oxford University Hospitals Trust. The majority of their delivery has now ended, and they have a very limited role remaining in the programme as it runs out. Next slide. Thank you. So in terms of the grants available, the Go-create grants within ISfB, the original budget for grants, so the amount that we would pay out to businesses, was £875,000. So far we have committed, so we have contracted with grant agreements out there and signed for just over £655,500. So we have about 25% of the grant pot remaining to be committed. So just over £219,000 remains to be committed. The maximum grant that we expect to give anyone is £50,000. The minimum grant is £1,000. Okay, so grant has to be at least £1,000 for it to be an eligible grant for ERDF. And the grant rate is a maximum of 25%. So for every £10,000 that you spend in total, the maximum that we would reimburse would be £2,500. We will continue to run Go-create grant rounds until we've committed the available grant funding. The obvious question that people frequently ask is how many more rounds do we think that is? How quickly will the funding be committed? This is entirely dependent on the applications that come in. Looking at those numbers, it could be 5 grant approvals and the budget is gone, assuming that they're at the high end of the spectrum. The absolutely worst case is that it's 219 grant applications of £1,000 each. That is very unlikely to happen. But I think we're looking at grant rounds running well into the rest of this year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the eligible activities for the Go-create grants? I've already said that they have to be revenue costs, so no individual item of more than £4,999. They're costs that can support investment in product and service development, technological and applied research, development of pilot lines. So it's all about early product validation and first production. It's really focused on developing and progressing innovative products and services that businesses are developing and taking those to market. We do not necessarily expect that you will go from a very early product concept stage through to launch into the market stage with your innovation. It's possible for some, it depends on the nature of the innovation. But we do expect that the Go-create grant will progress your innovation towards the market. So there does need to be within the grant applications an explanation and evidence of how this involves development, how this project will move your innovation forwards. Next slide. Thank you. We do take a very open approach to innovation. So that's what the graphic on this slide is supposed to convey. You have to be an SME to be eligible, but within that, we are open to the type of innovation that you're bringing. It can be product, it can be process, it can be service. One of the things that you are required to provide within the application is an explanation of what the innovation is, and also you have space to explain how it is innovative. How does this represent a step change? To what extent does this represent a step change? One of the areas of innovation, or the explanation around innovation, I should say, that tends to trip people up is drawing the distinction between an incremental change, so moving from version 1.7 to version 1.8 of something, and a step change, so something that is clearly innovative rather than part of the usual development process. If in doubt, please ask and have a conversation with the ISfB business advisor. But we do take an open approach to innovation, and we do score the extent to which ISfB applications are innovative, or perhaps more fairly, the extent to which an applicant has justified and demonstrated that their innovation is innovative. Next slide. So how does it work? I've mapped out on this slide a couple of grant scenarios so that you can see how it will work. I've also realized that I've failed to delete something from the second line. So the grant offer, for example, would be £40,000 of total eligible spend revenue only. There are no capital elements in ISfB at the moment. As I say, we've withdrawn those. The maximum grant we could offer against £40,000 of spend is £10,000, and the grant rate would be 25% of the eligible spend. So your grant offer letter will say, we will reimburse 25% of your total eligible spend up to a maximum of £10,000. So in scenario 1, underneath, you underspend, so it actually only costs you £30,000 to do your grant project. With total eligible spend of 30,000, the maximum grant we can pay is 25% of that, which is 7,500. So in scenario 2, you overspend against your planned expenditure. So your total eligible spend ends up being £50,000. The maximum grant we can pay is £10,000, which is the maximum grant that we have offered in the grant offer letter. So we will reimburse either 25% of your total eligible spend, or the maximum grant that we have offered, whichever is lower. Next slide. Thank you. So how do you apply? You read the guidance on the website. You can watch this webinar as many times as you like. It will be made available on YouTube, and there'll be a link on the website. We have Go-create grant guidance published on the website, as well as grant Q&As, some questions people have asked in the past. Please speak to the team and the ISfB business advisor. Fill out the application form. We have provided a checklist for you to use alongside the application form to make sure that you submit everything that we need, which will help accelerate the assessment process. It's very useful. I know it is. I drafted it. So please make use of that. And then wait and see. We do publish, hopefully on the next slide, the dates by which we will let people know the results of the applications. Next slide, please. There we go. So we normally take around about 3 weeks to process them. The cutoff date for applications is midday on the 3rd Friday of the month. So this month, that's the 21st of May. Next month, that's the 18th of June. And we'll notify you round about 3 weeks later. So the 11th of June is the date by which you'll be notified if you apply on the 21st. The 9th of July is the date by which you'll be notified if you apply on the 18th, or if you apply at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 21st of May. What will happen then is that your application will just be held until the next cut-off date. So please don't feel that you have to submit your applications on the morning of the cut-off date. You can submit at any point during the month when you're ready to submit. And all that will happen is that we will assess effectively in batches when we get to them. One thing that we can't do at the moment, unfortunately, is offer the soft check excuse me, proofreading service that we've been able to offer in previous rounds. If that changes, we will publish it, we'll publicize it, we will let you know. But at the moment, we cannot offer that soft check proofreading service. Next slide. So just to reiterate the critical things here, we can only reimburse expenditure that you've defrayed, that you've paid out from a bank account, that you incur after the date of the grant offer letter, or a date that we agree and specify in the offer letter. Okay, so if you put your application in and the day after you spend, you pay one of the consultants and they get started, that will not be eligible, because you were willing to engage that consultant without knowing that the grant was approved, and therefore, in an auditor's eyes, you did not require the grant in order to carry out that activity, so it will not be eligible. We do need to follow the procurement rules. 3 quotes does mean 3 quotes. Circumstances in which you won't have 3 quotes are fairly few and far between. And evidence for everything is the key. So if you have 3 quotes, we will need you to supply those 3 quotes. So are we flexible or are we rigid? We're as flexible as we can be within a fairly rigid framework. Next slide. So I'm now coming on to talk about why applications are unsuccessful. I deliberately don't do a session called How to Write a Successful Application, partly because if you do everything that I were to tell you in that session and you're not awarded the grant, you could potentially appeal, but also because this is a competitive process. We will at some point get to a point where we have more applications than we have available grant funding. But even so, we are only allowed to approve strong and high scoring, effectively, grant applications. That's one of the conditions the managing authority has put on us. Rightly so, we are not allowed to fund any application that comes through the door. They have to pass a certain threshold, they have to be approved by the grant panel. So why are applications unsuccessful? Length. Think Goldilocks. Your application should neither be too short nor too long. We do set word limits within the application forms. These are not targets. You do not score extra points for being 3 words away from the word limit rather than only using half the word limit. Your application needs to be as long as it needs to be within those word limits to tell the assessors everything that they need to know. So if you find that your application is at the word limit and you still have the same again to write, it's too long. You're putting too much detail in. If, however, you write 1 or 2 paragraphs, so half a page of application, realistically it is far too short. You will not have been able to give the assessors enough detail to be able to score your application highly. So make sure that your application length is appropriate for the project, the business and the grant that you're requesting. So for example, if you're requesting a £25,000 grant, for example, I would expect the application to be using most of the word limit. If you're requesting a £2,500 grant from ISfB, I would expect it to be shorter. That's an expectation, doesn't necessarily reflect reality. but do think about the length, because that feeds into the content of what you're putting into the words. Please don't be obtuse. Please don't use long and complicated words like obtuse. I do say this in every single grant workshop that I do, and we still receive grant applications where the assessors in the panel sit there and for the first couple of minutes, despite having read it several times, we're trying to work out what they're actually doing, what they're talking about. Please keep it clear, please keep it simple. Remember that you are the expert in your subject area, in your business area. The grant assessors may not be experts in that particular area. So please make sure that your application doesn't use highly technical terminology or jargon. Make sure that it's something that that is clear and understandable by non-expert readers. Style. I always say spell check is there for a reason, so please use it. I also always say that we will never fail an application on the basis of spelling and grammar. That's not the business that we're in. Assessors don't do that. One thing that does happen though is that if your application is filled with spelling mistakes or is difficult to read because the grammar is poorly written, it becomes much harder for an assessor to score it highly because we have to work out what it's saying. And if we have to try and work out what the sentence is saying, it's possible that we'll misunderstand it and therefore give it the wrong score. It also worries assessors. Assessors are aware that there are spell checks and grammar checks built into word processing packages, into Word. It raises a flag about the level of attention to detail within an application. Please check them. Please have somebody else check them. And I do come back to that in a later slide. Think about the quality of your application. So what I mean by this is take your time. I would have said use our checking service, and if that becomes available again, we'll let you know. But if you're starting to write your application 24 hours or 48 hours before the time at which you need to submit it, realistically, you haven't left yourself enough time to complete your application. If you're starting to write it now with the deadline on the 21st, then I think you've left yourself enough time to do a good job of drafting it. Rushed applications always show. Assessors can always tell when an application has been rushed. And please be consistent. So within your application, if you're asking for a grant of £12,043 on the first page, please make sure that you ask for the same £12,043 everywhere that you set out the grant request. If the number is different in the 2 or 3 places that the grant requested has to be entered in the application form, we as assessors don't know actually how much grant you're requesting. So please be consistent. And this comes down to checking again. Applications can be unsuccessful because people don't fill them in. So fill in everything. It's entirely possible that certain boxes will be left blank. If you do that, ask yourself whether you could put not applicable in that box and it still makes sense. So other sources of funding, yes, you could put not applicable in that box. If you haven't explored any others, your application still makes sense. If the box is percentage grant requested, you can't put not applicable in that box because the application doesn't make sense. You're requesting a grant percentage, usually 25%. So think about making sure that everything is completed. Again, that harks back to a checking of the application. Next slide, please. In terms of content, please don't assume prior knowledge. I've said that you are the subject experts in your business area and sector. Therefore, a lot of things may well go without saying to you. If you find yourself thinking that it goes without saying that, it never does. You will invariably one day meet an assessor who does not know whatever it is that goes without saying in your sector. If you're assuming prior knowledge, you will almost certainly not score as highly as somebody who explains whatever it is that they think people know already. So please don't assume prior knowledge. Assuming prior knowledge is a way in which applications score poorly. I read one a couple of weeks ago, and by the time I'd read it the third time through, I'd finally managed to work out what it was that they assumed I knew that I didn't know. And as soon as I figured out what shape that gap in the application was, the rest of it sort of made sense. But of course, without that prior knowledge, it was very difficult to score it highly because I didn't know what that blank place in the application was actually filled with. Please start at the beginning, go on to the middle, and finish at the end. This sounds fairly self-explanatory, but it can be quite difficult to do. You know your businesses, you are very excited by your projects and your activities and what you want to do with the grant. Therefore, it's very easy to jump straight into the grant project. This is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. Please start at the beginning. You need to tell us about your business. You need to set the scene and the context. Then tell us what the grant project is and why you need to do it. And then finish at the end. What will this deliver for you? What will the impact on your business and on the economy be as a result of the grant project? So think about the story. I don't like calling it a story, but I still haven't thought of a better term for it. Think about the story that you're telling us. What is it that we need to know? The background, the content of the project and the impact of the project. And within that, think about the relevance of the content. There are length restrictions, so telling us absolutely every detail of your business's journey is probably going to use up far too much of the available space within the application. So think about what it is that we need to know in order to understand and then assess your applications. Now, it may well be that you can't fit all of that in. It is possible to submit additional attachments and documents with your application. There are things that we specifically ask for: copies of companies' accounts, evidence of match funding, business plan, and so on. You can provide additional documents, additional evidence and attachments alongside the things that we specifically request. But please be careful doing them. What I mean by that is that applications will often fail because they see perfectly clearly that there's some prior knowledge that assessors won't have, and they decide that the best way to fill that is to attach a 250-page document that tells the assessors everything they need to know in advance of assessing the application. No assessor will have the time to go through a 250-page attachment for a Go-create application. If you must attach large documents as evidence, it is really helpful if you can direct the assessors to specific pages. So for more information or for background, please see page 3 or pages 201 to 2 of the attached document. Attachments of 1 or 2 pages, fine, assessors will have time to look at those. Attachments of 250 pages, 100 pages, whatever they may be, assessors will not have the time to go through the whole of those documents. So please use them with care. And if there are parts that you want assessors to look at, make sure that they are small parts and make sure you direct an assessor to them. Assuming that an assessor will have picked up on an obscure paragraph 90% of the way through a 250-page document is not going to help your application be successful. Next slide. Thank you. In terms of the process, I've got a couple of three-letter acronyms here. RTQ, read the question. We do set out very clearly within the guidance notes and the application form the questions that we're asking and the sort of things that we want covered within those questions. I'm always reminded of a story that an old history teacher of mine used to say, which was that they wrote their best essay on 17th century France in their final exams at university. As you do, they got to the end of the exam, they had 5 minutes left, so they glanced back through the questions and everything they'd done and realized that they should have written it on the 18th century. Read the question. Having read and understood the question, then ATQ, answer the question. This harks back to a lot of the reasons that applications are unsuccessful, because you do not tell the assessors the things that they need to know in order to score an application highly. If you tell us loads and loads and loads about, for example, the background to the company, and then a very small 4-line paragraph on what the actual grant project will do, it will be very difficult for an assessor to score that application highly because they can't really be sure what the project is doing. When we say 3 quotes, it does mean 3 quotes. Applications are often unsuccessful because they will just provide a single quote for £20,000 worth of work and say nobody else can possibly do this. If it's really impossible, then in an ideal world, you'll have confirmation from some other companies that they can't provide a quote, and ideally a comment at the bottom of that that says the only people we know are XYZ, and XYZ are the people you've got the quote from. Now, I have to be honest that I've never actually seen that produced in an application, but I should also point out that the first thing some assessors will do if they see a comment that says it is not possible for this service to be delivered by any other company is to go on Google the service, and invariably find somebody somewhere around the world who can deliver that service. If it really is impossible, make sure that you've got some evidence from people who say, no, we can't deliver it. Or who say, well, we can deliver something similar, but it's not quite what you wanted. Next slide. Thank you. So my closing comment before I move on to when you have a grant is to suggest that you have your applications proofread. Find somebody within the business, or even better, outside of the business, who can proofread the application for you. Can they understand it? Does it make sense? Does it tell them everything they need to know about the business and the grant project? If you can't do that, then at the very least, when you've drafted your application, put it to one side, leave it for a weekend, for a couple of days, go away and do something else, come back to it with fresh eyes and go through it again. I can't stress enough that applications are unsuccessful when people haven't given enough time and enough attention to proofreading and rechecking the applications. So when you have a grant, as I've said, please wait until the grant is awarded before spending the money. Please then actually spend it. We do find businesses that just don't carry out their grant projects, and eventually that money is recycled into the grant pot. If something changes in terms of what you're doing or when you're doing it, please contact us. Once you've spent the money, please claim it. This one I always find slightly more surprising than people not spending the money, because I do understand that these are innovation projects and things can change. But to have spent the money and then to not get round to claiming it back from us, I find very hard to understand. So please claim it. But if things change, if there are going to be delays, please tell us. I always say in these sort of grant projects, this is not a case where it is better to ask for forgiveness. It is always better to ask for permission, not forgiveness. If you tell us in advance that something is changing or it's being delayed or you want to do something differently, then we can make sure we work with you to keep it eligible, to keep it within scope of something that we can fund with the RDF. If you've done it already, so let's say you ran an open procurement, chose a supplier, for whatever reason the supplier pulled out, so you went with somebody completely different and paid them and then told us that you'd done it, that would be ineligible because you will not have followed the open procurement rules. If you'd told us when the supplier pulled out, we would have walked you through a process to redo the procurement, make sure that spend stayed eligible. Please talk to us, tell us if anything changes. And please make sure you provide the necessary evidence with your claim. The biggest thing that slows the claim process down within OxLEP is having to go back and forth to grant recipients asking for additional evidence and additional explanation. We're looking at these grant claims with an eye to what an auditor will think. So we need to be able to walk step by step through the process, following the invoice all the way through to defrail. In an ideal world, it's really simple, but invariably there is something in each grant claim that requires a bit of explanation. So please make sure you explain that, provide the evidence with it. It will speed up our processing of the claims and speed up your reimbursement. Next slide, because I think I'm almost at the end of my speaking section, which I think is pretty much on time with my first agenda slide. Welcome to watch this again, which includes the generic overview. Slides and the guidance are on the OxLEP website, and a link to this recording will be on YouTube, which is on YouTube, will be there as well. We do update Q&As when people ask us new or additional questions, so have a look at the FAQs. And if you have any questions that you're not raising today or that you have after today, please email them to the business@oxfordshirelep.com email address. And I'm fairly sure that the next slide now leads us into the question and answer part of today's webinar. There we go. So if I could ask Sophie and Peter to join me. There we go.
Great, thank you, James. I'm Sophie Lee, I'm the ISfB Programme Executive. I'll just be facilitating Q&A part of this session. Also joining on the panel is Peter Russell. Would you like to introduce yourself, Peter?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Peter Russell. I'm the Innovation Advisor for the Innovation Programme at OxLEP. So I work directly with clients on their projects and their innovation activities.
Perfect, thank you. We haven't had that many questions through yet on the chat, but I'll go through the ones we've had so far. But if you have any other questions you want to send through, then just pop them in on the chat and we'll pick those up as we go through. So one of the first questions we had was regarding funding costs for applying for trademarks. So I've replied saying, you know, we've got accessing expert services for advice on applying for trademarks is in scope. But I wondered, perhaps, James, if you could just expand on that, as we've had other questions like that regarding patents and things in the past, just to clarify.
So it's fairly straightforward. If there's a legal requirement to pay a certain cost, so a patent fee, for example, if you want a patent, you have to pay the patent office the patent fee in order to register the patent. It's a statutory requirement, otherwise you can't register the patent. Therefore, the patent fee itself is not an eligible cost for the programme. However, advice and support to draw up your patent application is an eligible cost for the programme, and the reason for that is that there is no requirement for you to have that support. You could, download the documents and draw up your patent application yourself. Therefore, the support to get you there is eligible. The fee itself is not eligible, and that's the principle that we'll apply across the board, be it a trademark, a patent, an ISO accreditation, whatever it may be.
Great, thank you, James. Another question here, perhaps Pacey could respond on this one. So are there types of projects that you prefer to fund? We have this particular project is a technology audit, improvements in SEO in mind to help us to stabilize systems and scale the business. Would this kind of project appeal to you as a funding body?
Potentially, but a gut reaction to that description, which is obviously rather than innovation. So I know these things are down to different people's definitions and are rather subjective evaluations in general, but the way you've described it there, we would have to help work with you and encourage you to think about the level of innovation that you're trying to introduce. Now, if that is reasonable, even significant, but at least reasonable, then I think it is something that the panel would support. But if it just looks like business as normal and isn't really going to open up a huge amount in terms of potential for the business, then it's questionable. But I think generally what we encourage people to do is to get in touch with one of the team before they even fill in an application form. And we can give a bit of feedback on the basic idea based on a simple written description in an email or something like that, and then see if there is a way that you can actually present it slightly differently to bring out the innovation within it.
Great, thank you, Peter. Next question, we've got a few coming in now. So next question, could we clarify the excluding criteria for services of general economic interest with some examples?
I might defer to James for that one, although the only one that I've come across recently was where we had somebody that was introducing an innovation actually to a wine producing to a farm, basically, and I think that was excluded, unfortunately, because it's primary production of food, which is a real shame, because what they were applying to us for was the technology around that rather than anything to do with the core of that. So we had to find a different way to help them. James, do you mind if I defer to you on that one?
How kind? No, not at all. There is a particularly clunky definition of services of general economic interest. The sort of shorthand for it is public sector. So service of general economic interest, for example, would be a school that provides generalized school age education to children. NHS is another example. Now, this does not mean that if you are a medtech innovator developing something that you plan to sell to the NHS, that we can't support you. We absolutely can. That is within scope, and we funded those sort of projects before. But what it means is that a doctor's surgery, for example, would be very unlikely to be eligible for an ISfB grant. It's not a question that comes up very often. In fact, it's only explicitly been asked of me. I think this is the third time anyone's ever actively asked what a service of general economic interest is. And it's usually easier to have the discussion once you've had a look at the definition, looking at the specifics of your business to see whether you're in scope or out of scope. But it's sort of shorthand for public sector. It's shorthand for things that local or national governments should be doing.
Great, thank you both. Next question we've had in here, would environmental test costs be eligible for a new project? For example, temperature, humidity, if a quote was 10K, for example?
The quick answer to that one, I think, is yes, probably. I mean, again, it would come with regard to a little bit more qualification, as in, why are you performing those? Why do you need to perform those tests? You know, what's it for? So if they are about bringing a new product or service to market, and it's proving the validity of the technology or something like that, which it sounds like it probably is, then absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Peter. And then,
sorry, Sophie, just to say, you know, just to emphasize something that James was covering in the main session. You may know who you want to perform those tests for you, but you will have to, unfortunately, go and get alternative quotes for those services regardless, unless you can prove to us that they are absolutely the only people that can do those tests, which is feasible, but not taken as granted. So just bear in mind that you may have already been in discussion with the people that can provide those services, but you're going to have to go back a step and get alternative quotes from other people, which we kind of encourage in any case in terms of your own due diligence and good practice. But it does introduce a bit of a delay sometimes.
Thanks, Peter. And the follow-up to that question kind of links into the first question. Similarly, what about CE certification for a new product being eligible cost?
Yeah, for me, that's slightly more difficult, because CE marking is a legal requirement to be able to supply. It's not necessarily part of the innovation process. I think we'd have to look at sort of something along, you know, how much of a proportion of costs that involved, and how much of it was near the end of the CE certification process, which you're actually paying for the final audit or something like that, or whether you're at the beginning of it and getting professional advice as to how to make your product CE markable, for example. It's sometimes since I've dealt with that kind of certification systems and processes, but I think in the past we were able to support professional advice about having, you know, a CE strategy, for example, rather than some qualified auditor or certification body that gives you the final stamp at the end. So again, it may be a question of the detail and the presentation of that detail. Is that fair enough, James? Because I think it might be a bit problematic if it was right at the other end.
No, you're spot on.
Great, thank you both. A brief question just about, are we able to run our company as a limited company. We've yet to register ourselves in the early stages. So I guess just to note on that, to be able to sign up and apply for ISfB, you need to have either be a sole trader or have already registered your business. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Peter or James?
No, I think we've worked with companies who are transitioning between self-employment or sole trader and becoming a limited company. I think what we don't want to do is force you into being a limited company before before it's the right time for you. But unfortunately, we can't award grants or give to support to non-legal entities, and a limited company is the most obvious one, but we can work with sole traders if you are registered with HMRC. It's just a bit neater and tidier if you do become a limited company, and it's probably something in your trajectory in any case. And so it is something which some people have brought forward, and in this country is relatively quick to do. So that's just one of the considerations.
Absolutely, thanks, Peter.
In the technical terminology, you have to be an undertaking in the eyes of the regulations. The most obvious is a limited company, but also sole trader kind of structure is fine, it's acceptable. It's an entity that is undertaking trade, if you like, and trading. What we cannot support is somebody who is pre-start, who has an idea, but hasn't started doing anything yet. Fortunately, that's out of scope for ISfB.
Just to reiterate, at the risk of labouring the point, but we have worked with quite a lot of people who are pre-revenue. So you can have a limited company that doesn't make any money or hasn't got to revenue yet, and that's okay. I mean, it still means you have to be a viable business from your own investment or other ways, but you don't have to be generating revenue. It's useful if you are, but
Thank you both. A question regarding impact on Oxfordshire. So would bringing tourism and money to Oxfordshire be a positive in the eyes of the assessors?
Yeah, I don't see why not. The trick would be to qualify that and indeed to quantify it if you can. So I think James made this point. I was joining the webinar a little bit late, but I think James made the point about don't make unsubstantiated claims. So you can claim that you're going to have an impact on, or your technology or your innovation is going to have an impact on that sector, and that would be welcome, particularly at this time. But unless you can back up those claims, then they're a little bit meaningless. So yes, that's a valid impact amongst others. But like with any claim or impact statement, we'd need to know how you're going to measure it, and hopefully measure it, if not during the life of the project, then soon after.
That's a good point, and I'm not convinced I made that as clearly as Peter has, but yeah, absolutely. If you're going to tell us you will create a certain number of jobs, be realistic, don't overpromise, because you will almost certainly score down if an assessor feels that the promise is not realistic and not feasible. And as Peter says, make sure you explain how whatever you promised is achievable and realistic.
Great, thank you both. Another question about eligible costs. So what about the costs of introducing machine learning or artificial intelligence to your products to make them smarter?
Yeah, I mean, I refer to a previous answer I gave, which was yes, but as long as it's not just a simple incremental improvement, which doesn't really open up any new markets or any new sales or any new customer groups, so the impact is rather sort of modest, and the innovation is maybe modest in the sense that you're embracing technology which already exists rather than developing new technology. I mean, we can support that, but we have to see that it has some impact on you and hopefully more widely. But absolutely, quite a few of our recent applications have had some element. People use those terms quite widely and freely. So we might have a look at it and say, actually, that's not really AI, but you know, that's not probably so important as whether it represents a reasonable level of innovation and is going to make a significant difference, rather than just, you know, something that you have to do probably to stay in business or stay up with the competition.
Thank you, Peter. Another question here, we're a very early stage, need some support developing a market-ready MVP from our initial research. As a student founder, I can't cover the 75% of the project costs. What sources of funding would you recommend to find this?
Unfortunately, you're going to have to find sources, primarily non-grant funding sources. So there is no easy answer to this. You're going to have to put in friends and family type money, and once you've exhausted that, you're probably going to have to look for some kind of investor, which is very difficult to do at such an early stage, obviously. I mean, the workaround to this, to be honest, is that we can support you, but it's probably going to be for a more modest project size that you are able to contribute most of the cost of, I'm afraid. Even if we were able to find other grant sources for you, you wouldn't probably be able to match those against ours and therefore make up the 100% of costs, because that's quite problematic to do. So we're happy to talk to you about general sources of funding for startups, but you're competing with a lot of other people in that space at the moment. Sorry, that's not very positive, is it? But I think it's the reality. For this particular scheme, we are really only able to help people that already have a good idea of where their chunk of the funding, which is the majority of it, is going to come from.
There was just a follow-up to that. It may have come through in between your answer there, Peter, but asking whether 75% in part can come from another ERDF source, which I think you'd already covered off, really.
I think if it's another ERDF source, then it's a big no, and it's probably quite an easy one for us to say no to. If people are in receipt of some grant money or loans from other sources that you're not sure whether it's, well, you know it's not ERDF, but you think it might be under some other system or regime of grant funding, then let us know and we'll do our best to explore it to see whether it is possible to match it against ours. But it's much easier for everybody concerned, I'm afraid, if the money is what James may have called clean, i.e. not from drug trafficking or something, but you know, is from a private sector source.
Thank you, Peter. That's all the questions we've had come through so far. We've just had a couple of comments just saying thank you to the panel. It's really helped and it's helped them be more clear on what they need to describe in their application. So just thanks to everyone on the panel. Is there anything you want to add, Peter, at this point, or James, before we close off the session.
A closing comment from me is that I am available to help people shape projects, but it's only really sort of useful to talk to me if you think you're in a reasonably strong position with regard to both the level of innovation and also having the match funding, having your side of the funding kind of organized. If you haven't got that lined up, then we can still support you in your innovation work, but it probably won't be worth a detailed conversation about Go-create unless you're in that position. But happy to look at projects, definitely.
Absolutely, thank you, Peter. And also just to reiterate, as Peter mentioned earlier, if you want to send through a brief summary of your project for the team to review before you start writing your application to check project costs are in scope or any other queries you might have, then as per the email address on the slides, just send through your queries to the business@OxLEP email address, and the team will get back to you. So at this point, I just want to say thank you very much to James for the presentation and being on the panel, as well as Peter. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining the session today. I hope you find it helpful. And yeah, please do get in touch with the team if you have any further questions to this. We'll be sending out the slides along with paperwork and things after the event, and then we'll also be uploading this to our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and we'll close off the session.
Yeah, good luck, everybody.
You.
Thank you.